So let's hop into one thing that we started actually back a couple of sessions ago with Brian Smith of Intuit, talking about kind of the structure and thinking a little bit about, obviously from your management perspective, there's a lot that goes into conversational AI and every team's a little bit different. So can you give us kind of a 10,000 foot view of all the different roles and the way that you approach and the roles that you work with on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I alluded to this in the last slide as well, is that conversational AI is just something that's super highly collaborative. And, being in roles that are less mature versus more mature, I've seen different organizations do it in a lot of different ways. When I started at Rocket as a first conversation designer, we didn't have a product manager, a UX researcher, a product designer. We just had like software engineers, data scientists, and I was the first conversation designer. And as we built out that team, and as I've started working for companies that have like a more mature, well thought out conversational AI like area, we start to add in more roles. That UX researcher role is really important to do things like user research, do things like user testing to understand what it is like our end users want, what's working, what's not. Product designers, as you start thinking about like multimodal conversational experiences, are pivotal to try to bring those to life. And then data analysts, super important, one of the most important roles. Yeah, those are just some of the roles that I think that as you work on, you start to add and they start to bring in a lot of value.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing it's not just conversation designers, it's not just developers doing this, right? It's to have a really good assistant and an omnichannel assistant, you have to have all these roles working in tandem. So good that you're seeing that on your team as well. So let's hop into the actual tips that people are here for today, right? And tips that I think you'll talk to that you've actually implemented and that you probably live by on a day-to-day basis when it comes to proving these results. So we have 4 of them. We'll go around the horn. Why don't we start with this first one? Tell us a little bit about kind of that metric side of it.
Yes, absolutely. So this first one seems really obvious, but I think it's one that I cannot stress about enough. And it's just to pick metrics that your organization or your company cares about. Oftentimes, you start out with a conversational experience and it's easy to prove something out that the business might not necessarily care about. And it's almost impossible, if not very, very hard to get people to care about something that they're not already looking at. So an example of that is if your organization has decided that they're only worried about like profit for the next 12 months, and you start building out a conversational experience, that's more like based in support or more based on like a metric that they're just not looking at. It's really hard to talk to business partners and higher level like stakeholders if you're not speaking the same language. So really trying to pick KPIs, metrics that they're already caring about, so that you have that like shared common language, and it just makes things easier to explain.
That's spot on. You can't just keep your chat assistant in the chat bubble. It's got to think about it from the business perspective, right? And I think we'll hit on that in the demo a lot more, but that's a great number one. Let's number 2, talking about success.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So I think this is another thing that I feel like I can't stress any of these enough. But this is definitely a something that I made like mistakes on in the past. And it's really like understanding what success is, defining and aligning on what success is before going live with anything, and knowing how to measure it. And those are 2 different things, and I'll talk about those separately. The first part of that, understanding what success is, what that really means is making sure that every single person that matters is aligned on, hey, for this project to be super successful, this, and this needs to happen. You can get into a meeting, you can write those things down. They can be like really hard numbers, like, hey, we want like a 3% increase in conversion on this website. Or they can be like, oh, we want, to A/B test it and we want our NPS score to go up, whatever that may be. Making sure that all of the stakeholders are aligned on that and that you have like that higher level buy-in. The second thing is making sure you understand how to measure it. And I cannot say how many times something's gone live, we've had success metrics, and then we have actually no way of measuring it. And so we're like, we think this is successful. We're kind of back against the data, but we don't have clear data to tell us. So I think those are both super important, even before shipping, like even before you begin designing, because I think once you know what success is, it's easier to design, it's easier to bring those experiences to life. And you can kind of use that success metric as like a blueprint to go about your whole like thought process, design process, execution process.
Yeah, it's one thing to have a bigger seat at the table for CAI, but you have to come with the numbers to back up that bigger seat. I think that now that the voice is there, right?
Yeah, precisely.
And then the third one, all about running
Yeah.
experiments.
Yeah, I absolutely love experiments. There's so many different kinds of experiments you can run. I think everyone probably knows about A/B testing. That's a super, super popular one. There's a great video on YouTube about how Netflix A/B tests. So if you're not familiar with A/B testing, I would highly recommend checking that out. A/B testing essentially is just splitting traffic. You can do it with A and B, so a control and a variant. You can do like multivariate testing where you test multiple different things with one thing that's changed. So kind of like one independent variable. Just seeing like, hey, are we able to move the needle on that? Is success happening? What's going on? That's not to say that you have to A/B test, and this is something that I've kind of like learned throughout my career is oftentimes A/B testing can be a little bit hard. It requires infrastructure, it requires engineers. You might not always have those resources. So that's kind of why I say experiments, because there's definitely different things you can do. So some of the things that I've done in the past are things like historic testing, which is definitely not like a best practice, but it's essentially like comparing a data set to a previous data set. So for example, you have a change go live, right? And then you compare it to a historic change. So at Rocket, when we actually had our conversational system go live on our website, we didn't have a way to A/B test it. So we actually just pushed it to prod, and then we compared it to the week previous. And we just said like, hey, is there enough of a signifier here to understand like if there's an ROI, is there any value? Another thing that we did was like user testing, and that's obviously more qualitative. But if you're in an organization where, they're a little bit more risk averse and they don't want something going live without, actual proof that it's going to go really, really well, you can either do like a focus group where you can have people sign NDAs, you can do user tests, you can even like internally user test with like customer support people or sales people or anyone who sits really, really close to customers, and really just get some qualitative feedback on, hey, what's working, what's not. And I think someone just dropped it in the chat, and I totally agree. Qualitative and quantitative tests are both super, super helpful. And we'll talk about that a little bit more moving forward as well, is that oftentimes you don't need quantitative data to be able to prove that there's value. Oftentimes just qualitative data is enough to like get started.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I think the more mature teams, maybe the more iterative design review and like optimization testing might be done earlier, right? But I think what you're talking about is like teams like create good assistants that get to production quick, great. And then as you grow, add more layers of A/B testing and experimentation, to prove that ROI.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. And I think the thing with experiments is that people often want to prove how much value there is. And I think that's kind of like the wrong way of looking at things, especially starting out. I think that when you're first starting out, you just need to prove that there is value. And then you can kind of back into how much value. So kind of like take it bite size. And yeah, the fourth point on just proving out the value is just not focusing on that quantitative impact. Funny story, I was a UX designer for a very long time, working on conversational systems. And I had this meeting with the entire product design team, and I was really, really excited for it because I had this roadmap to prove that there is, all of this money in conversational, design and really like implementing this conversational experience. And I get to slide 2, and the design team was like, okay, like I understand the business value, but like, is this good for our users? Like, why do we care? And I realized like I was talking to a bunch of UX people who didn't care about, the quantitative impact or the business impact. They cared about the UX impact. And so I think depending on your stakeholders, there's different things that people care about. And when you talk about like value and ROI, it's not only a monetary thing. Oftentimes there's, sometimes intangible things or things that different partners will care about more, that you can kind of talk about too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that set us up for a really good next part of the deck here, because it's all frameworks, right? You touched on this a little bit, but we kind of built out the different levels of impact that ROI can have. Can you walk us through kind of these 3 here, and maybe the example or 2 that you mentioned from both?
Yeah, for sure. So yes, there's qualitative, quantitative, and business. So qualitative impact is really like that descriptive. It's like what, like the kind of like the why around like why is it happening? And it really helps you kind of understand like kind of like the quantitative would be like what is going on and like the numerical, and the qualitative would be like why is this going on and what are people saying about it. So when you look at like qualitative impact, you can look at like survey comments is like a huge one. So one of the most popular things that people do when they first launch conversational experiences is like NPS, and with NPS they ask for feedback. So there's kind of that quantitative, which is NPS, that net promoter score. It's a number. You're not going to understand why the number is the number. You're just going to say, hey, we have an NPS of 8 this week, and we had an NPS of 7 last week. And then when your business partners are like, well, why did it increase? That's when you move into the qualitative and you say, hey, these are all the survey comments. And, last week there was a bug, and this week we fixed the bug, and we're able to, kind of correlate that number to that description. Both of those are super, super important types of impact, depending on who you're talking to. They have various degrees of importance. So typically, like I found that if you go to a product person or a finance person and you talk qualitative, it kind of goes a little bit over their heads because they're very numbers oriented. Whereas if you go to, a UX person or a marketer or someone who really cares about the customer experience, that qualitative impact kind of like hurts them a little bit or like pulls at their heartstrings a little bit because it's more customer focused and customer obsessed. And then you have that business impact, which is, I think, if you think about impact as like a maturity model, that business impact is really the most mature. And that essentially is like really tying into what your company cares about, kind of what we talked about earlier. So let's take like NPS as an example. So your net promoter score, that typically tells you how that's a good indication of if people are saying, they're going to refer you to like friends and family, which is a good indication that you did a great job, that you did a great enough job that they want to, like promote you. Like community promotion is like a great way to, kind of like build a product or build whatever you're trying to do. We have that qualitative impact, which was that survey. We have the quantitative impact, which is that number. The business impact would actually be like how many people place the second order, how many people are referrals if you have some sort of referral program. And that actually directly ties into ROI from a revenue perspective. So then you can go to, like a finance person or a C-suite person, and you can say, hey, we have an NPS of 8. We have all these, descriptions that say that we are doing absolutely incredible. And as a result, we've had, like 15% more referrals in the month of August than we did in the month of July. And that's kind of telling that whole complete mature story.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the business to the right kind of combines the qual and quant. It stacks, right?
Yeah.
As far as like what you're able to do with that. And I think it rolls in perfectly to kind of this framework that you've developed of like, I think managers can actually follow exactly what we're about to say, which is pretty exciting. So we as a design manager or anyone in conversational AI, you're going to be interfacing with various teams. But let's take these three, for example, UX, data science, and revenue product, right? So we'll go through like a team, the impact that you focus on, and then the asset or like the data point that you'd want to hit. So let's start with UX and kind of talk through your approach if you're delivering ROI to UX.
Yeah, I absolutely love this because I've just learned when talking to UX teams, when talking to data science teams, you really have to speak their language. You really have to have that shared understanding. And so having different assets for different teams just really helps, just get on the same page really, really quickly. For UX teams, I'm a UX person at heart. So there's so many things that I've done. My absolute favorite, I'm going to start from the bottom of that assets, is heat maps. Everyone loves a good heat map. I actually used this back in 2019 when we built a conversational landing page, and we were able to show our UX folks where people were focusing on the page, where people were scrolling, where people were reading the most. Conversational experiences tend to be a little bit more like you have to read them, to kind of go through it. And that really helped us, design like a better UI. There's also stuff like moderated user tests. In the past, I've used tools like usertesting.com, where they actually allow you to run either unmoderated or moderated user tests and collect feedback. There is nothing more powerful than getting all a UX team into a room and showing them video clips of people failing with a product. It's super, super frustrating. We've done it so many times. You just kind of want to scream at the screen and just be like, hey, the button's right there, or like the thing is right there. It's not that hard. But it really has that, you can kind of feel like you're in the, you can feel the user's pain point, and that's really, really helpful. To save time, sometimes we've like extracted user quotes. One of my favorite like ways of doing that is almost to make it seem like social proof. So I kind of designed them like a little Amazon review, where I'll be like, hey, this was like a 4-star review, because people understand that, right? And people make decisions based off of social proof. And so kind of have user quotes like that go out in like emails or decks, so that people don't necessarily have to like play videos if they're not in a, in a space where they can do that. Prototypes are super helpful. Journey maps are super helpful. Anything just really visual, I think, really helps, like, UX teams understand and get on the same page on what's the impact and how are users really like interacting with the conversational experience.
Amazing. And we'll also show kind of like the shareable prototypes and different ways that that is an easy share internally when you're pulling out specific transcripts alongside more of the moderated user testing as well. So let's look at data science, kind of that same flow. Then we also had a good question in the chat that I'll finish this slide with at the end, in terms of attribution across the board.
Awesome, cool. Yeah, so for data science, again, super important to speak the data science language, which I've slowly but surely been picking up. There's a ton of different things you can do. F-score, super, super, super important. The things that I like are like recall and precision, which are both metrics that data scientists understand. And it's essentially knowing, like, are your utterances hitting the mark? Are they accurate? Are you responding with the right information? Really making sure that your model's trained really well. Intent coverage is one of those things that you can actually tie directly back to ROI. Intent coverage is essentially like, hey, you're like, do you have responses for everything that a user is asking for? If you find that your intent coverage is, for example, like 80%, what's the 20% that's not being covered? Is that something that we can cover? And is that like saving our business money, or is that like going into a use case that we haven't potentially thought of yet? Super important. Containment is what I like to define fully handled by the conversational experience. Also a super great ROI metric, because it really helps us understand what are the things that don't require human intervention? What are the things that we can completely self-contain? And one of the things I absolutely love about conversational experiences is you just have so much raw data, those transcripts. There's so much you can do with them. You can, visualize, how are people having conversations? Are they jumping from intent to intent? Are they having linear conversations? Are they kind of going all over the place? All of those things really help data scientists understand, like, how is this thing being used from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective? How can we train it so that it's being used more accurately, and really like extracting all of that user data to build a more meaningful and impactful experience.
Yeah, I love that. It's kind of like finding the leaky faucet, right, between data and design, of like, there's a missing intent, there's a missing utterance. Like, those are dollars left on the table. That is, containment score being broken at that point, because you're not being able to help to the full capacity. So that maps directly to ROI. And then lastly, probably the most tied to ROI is like conversations with revenue and even product, right?
Yeah. So conversations with revenue and product, I feel like, are pretty straightforward, because you're getting less into the qualitative and usually more into just, impact when it comes to money, dollar amount, depending on the organization that you're in. So you would be using those, the UX metrics and the data science metrics to kind of back into what's the potential revenue, what's the conversion rate, if there is one, what are the types of users using the product, and really trying as hard as you can to either put like a dollar amount or a cost savings amount, or whatever your end KPI is.
Absolutely. One of the questions I wanted to hit right here before we move on was from June. Just talking about, when you're talking about ROI on like the NPS or the CSAT side of things, do you have ever seen a difference between designers and devs kind of like fighting for attribution on those metrics? Like, it was my change that did this, or is it the API that did this? And how do you handle that from like your point of view, which is more spoke on the wheel of managing different departments like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have actually seen that in the past. And I think my answer for that is, you don't know what you don't know. And so oftentimes, you'll have multiple changes that are being made, and you can't really attribute one or the other. And sometimes you don't even need to attribute it to something, because, to back out and say, like, for example, if you made an API change and you made, 3 design changes and something improved, you're not going to be like, okay, what made it improve? Let's back out and see which one it attributed to. At that point, there's no point, right? You're a team, something made it work. Let's keep moving forward. I think that it's one of those things where you're like, here are the changes that we made. This is what improved. We've yet to find like a causation or like a correlation between which one, impacted it, and then move forward to see like, okay, now let's make like another change, but let's just have it be isolated and see if that improves. And I think those isolated changes are really helpful once you reach a certain maturity. Obviously, when you're first starting out, you're not going to be able to make isolated changes because you're kind of working on everything at once and you want to get everything out at once. And then once you hit like a point, you kind of like hit a plateau where you're like, okay, now we're making like a change every 2 weeks or change every iteration. Then it's a little bit easier to say, okay, this is what impacted this. But at first, it's kind of like all hands on deck, kind of crazy. Everyone's doing, like a bunch of different things. And that's okay, like as long as your metrics are moving in a positive direction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And a follow-up question to that is talking about, okay, so great. So you have like multi-channel when it comes to, to a conversational AI assistant suite. Is there a way that you found to kind of isolate the impact of a specific channel and knowing that all of it rolls up to overall ROI and customer satisfaction?
Yes, that is a great question. So in a multi-channel world, each channel is going to have different KPIs that you're looking at. So for example, with like phone calls, a huge metric that people look at is like time on phone, because that's really, really expensive. With email, it's usually like resolution time, because email is a little bit slower. With conversational AI, a lot of the times it's things like containment, because with conversational AI, you really want to try to contain and try to solve as many problems like inside of the chatbot or inside of the conversational experience as you can. And so I think isolating the metrics that matter for each of those channels and being able to track those, and then understanding that there's also ROI in like shared channels. So for example, if something starts off in if something starts off in the chatbot and ends up in a phone call, that's okay. That's not a failure. But knowing that that phone call might have been like shorter, or like a customer support agent or whoever might have already had like 50% of the context, so they were able to jump in and help immediately. So being able to kind of track those and see if there's a metric that you can pull that kind of shows that impact is really important.
Yeah, and I actually think you hit on something interesting there. It's almost like on each platform, understand the referrals and the sources to those platforms, and understand like the metrics from the individual sources, right? Because like if it came from chat, it oftentimes closes or their satisfaction score equals X, right? And I think that helps you better understand kind of that handoff between channels based on like where it came from, right? So that's another way to kind of drill down, but also understand that they're all connected, right?
Yeah, and I think I said this earlier too, is just defining what success is before you go out into the wild. Because oftentimes I see with support channels, you go out into the wild and people are like, okay, but what about all these other support channels? And then you get kind of overwhelmed. And so you kind of have to be really laser focused and be like, here's success. This is what we accomplished, and we're looking big picture, but we're also looking at the impact that we're bringing in.
Yeah. And I think it's funny that this is the next slide here, but you said this when we were prepping, and I want you to kind of hit on this just a little bit, because we're talking very much like prove ROI, but kind of the inverse is equally refreshing here.
Yeah, Sam and I were talking like a couple of days ago, and I said this and I just saw him like scribbling it down, and I'm like, oh, I must have said something interesting. But yes, I definitely love this. I love that I'm quoting myself here. But yeah, proving ROI is not always worth the ROI it'll bring. And I think this is like super, super important, especially to like product managers and finance people. It's like oftentimes it might take like, 6 to 9 months to prove that there's ROI in an idea, especially with conversational, agents and systems. And that's not always worth it. If you're spending, 6 months, 9 months, or like hundreds and hundreds of dev hours to prove out that, hey, this idea might be worth it, that's not lean, that's not agile, that's not scrappy. And so that kind of like back to what I said earlier is you don't necessarily need to prove how much value there is at first. You just need to prove that there is value and then take it, inch by inch. Instead of saying like, I can prove the exact amount of ROI, present this to our business leaders, and then start to work on it. That's just not going to work in the real world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we're going to show exactly how teams like yourself are doing that in Voiceflow, is kind of like thinking scrappy and thinking like iterative versus let me create a consultancy 100-page deck and present why and what expected results. No, like let's test it with 40 people and see what happens. And then build
Exactly.
on that, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the new ROI that you're talking about. So
Mhm.
let's hop into the demo kind of brief here before I actually hop into the tool. So the idea for this is talking about, okay, let's map business goals to conversational AI goals. So for example, right, like the prompt that you might get from a business leader disconnected from conversational AI might be, hey, we need to like better activate net new users to Instacart. Let's just call it like the desktop experience, right?
Mhm.
And okay, so great, we need to activate them to get quicker to initial purchase and like build out a cart and purchase, right? So that's acquisition, retention, and then revenue, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
yes.
eh,
Super hypothetical business goals, of course. And I think they're what I like about these is that they kind of are very similar to like I think everyone can kind of relate to them. As you're either trying to hit acquisition, you're trying to hit retention, revenue, something that everyone cares about. And then tying those business goals to those conversational goals, super important.
I will kind of do like a high level look at kind of the idea of this very simple this simple kind of mock example, and then we'll kind of talk about where we can maybe map the user journey to the actual business goals. So in this example, as a designer, just for the sake of taking a look here, we use some logic and an if condition here to say, okay, great. So like we want to understand a new customer. So if sessions, for example, if sessions is less than one, so i.e. they've never used the assistant before, we're going to consider them a new customer, and we're going to send them down the unactivated customer route, right? So great, we know exactly who we're talking to. We're defining a specific audience here. So now great, we jump to this block, and we're going to go right in and say, hey there, I see you're new. What's your name? Right? We're going to capture that name and then immediately say, okay, great, let's get you started with your first order. And something I wanted to call out here, Ayesha, is something that actually Brian Smith brought up a week or so back, is that I think oftentimes we're conditioned where these chat experiences are very like menu driven. It's like, hey, I see you're new. Here's 17 things you can possibly do with Instacart, right? Which is absolutely not best practice, or nor the way we like to buy or have a journey. So instead here, we know already based on customer insights, the fact that they just signed up, that they are new. So let's hit them with a contextual message that's actually helpful to this point of the user journey, which is, let's get you started with your first order. Do you find that kind of pivot from right now, like long menus to more like, hey, we're going to use customer insights behind the scenes to hit you with what you actually need?
No, I absolutely love that. And one of the things that actually frustrates me about customer menus is oftentimes we don't even want them taking certain actions. I'll see customer menus that are like, like 6 or 7 different prompts, and 2 of them are really negative, like I lost my order, or like like I need an agent right away. And from a business perspective, we don't want them clicking on those. From a user perspective, we don't want to hit them with negative options the first time they're ever like interacting with us. So they almost like don't make sense. And then just from like a personal perspective, I get overwhelmed when I see like multiple choices.
Correct. It's the easiest thing just to X out at that point, right? And
Yeah.
then your conversational AI work is just bucketed in that little box again, versus thinking about it as like an omni-channel presence and an extension of your brand, which you want Instacart to be friendly and
Yeah.
logical based on where they are in the journey.
Yeah,
Great.
absolutely.
So then I'll keep kind of showing the journey, run a quick test, and then we can go through. So I've used topics here to kind of folderize and order here. So as you can see, after clicking start an order, we jump into the place an order topic. So from here, I just wanted to show an example of maybe how you might use like an API with a developer ahead of time for example, to leverage customer data. So for example, in this scenario, a customer has just signed up. So you know name, email, probably zip code or region, right? So what you're able to do here, for example, is saying, okay, great, like placing an order is super easy and takes no more than 5 minutes. Let me see which stores are nearby, right? And this is a great chance where you could leverage the provided zip code and the customer data to then immediately understand and level, the grocery stores nearby that customer, right? Without needing to ask, where are you? What store do you like to shop at, right? That becomes, again, stop asking and start providing context. Then we move through, we pick a store, and then we level we pick a store and then we level a carousel to actually simulate a cart shopping experience. So let me run a quick test here. I'll get rid of the API block because obviously we don't have one built in this scenario, just so that this can work. So let me throw this here. Great. So let me go back to the start and I'm going to run a quick test real quick. Hey there, I see you're new. I'm going to say my name's Sam. Great. And you see there's not many options right now, right? We're keeping it pretty simple. Great. I know I want to start an order. Perfect. And we see we hop right in, placing order super easy. Let me see which stores are nearby. Both Kroger and Aldi are currently open here. Which one would you like to shop at? For this example, I'll do Aldi. Great. And again, here, this is where that time would be a variable that would be leveraged by an API component, right? And saying, okay, I know distance, I know where you're located, I know that store's preferences. In this example, and we'll go, okay, great, let's start shopping. And now we have a carousel built into the experience, and we're able to say, okay, great, low-fat milk, eggs. I had to add Oreos just because I always buy Oreos when I go to the grocery store. And great, so this is where then someone would immediately add to the cart. So this is not like a revolutionary per se, chat experience, but it is definitely improved upon in terms of that being a shopping assistant versus a menu or a navigational informational assistant. But I think the one thing that I did want to call out here is, I think a lot of teams, conversation design teams, will stop there, right? They're saying, oh, great, we created a great assistant. Awesome. But I think the next part is kind of mapping the user journey elsewhere to parts of this assistant, which is obviously where you're thinking a little bit more advanced in terms of ROI. So let's kind of go through for the sake of mapping Voiceflow to ROI, and where can we start mapping like the different levels of like the buying journey on this canvas?
Yeah, while you were walking through that, I was like chugging coffee because I was so excited. But yeah, if we zoom into the start there. So I love the, hey there, I see you're new. Love the capturing the name to start with. I think that's a very, very conversational experience. And I think that's it's a great signifier. And what that means is essentially like if someone's willing to transact with us, they're giving us their name, and we know that absolutely immediately. So if someone gives us, their name, we can kind of say like, okay, that person is willing to work with us. That person is like interacting with us in a positive way. And I think that's a great, like I said, it's just a great signal. Then going into the menu. So let's get started with your first order. Every single person that's clicking on start an order, we can say that those people are interested in placing an order with us. That is a huge signal, especially as like, I think you said that for the specific case, we're trying to get people to actually place an order, right? So I would say like for an ROI perspective, every single person that clicks start an order is a potential very, very, very high intent customer. And so I think that's like super, super interesting. And they don't even necessarily need to place an order. Just the idea that they're willing to click on a button that says start an order is like, gets me super excited. And then, digging into that place an order a little bit deeper. Yeah, there's just so much great information here, honestly. Same with, both Kroger and Aldi are currently near you. I think, well, actually just to back up, like even like the placing an order is super easy and won't take more than 5 minutes. I think the numbers, like all of the numbers that you used, if you look at the verbiage and all of the content, it's really empowering a user, and it's really adding that level of confidence, and you can see that it is definitely tailored for your use case. So it's tailored for that success metrics. And that's why I say it's so important to know what success is before you start designing, because I can tell that you are designing this knowing that success was them placing an order. You're stressing on how easy it is. You're stressing on the value, which is that it's so much faster using their conversational experiences. You're stressing a little bit later on that delivery time, like, hey, 5:22, like right now, checking my phone, it's 3:43, 5:22 is less than 2 hours away. I'm immediately like, oh, dang, like you guys are on top of your game. And so I think, yeah, just wanted to add the content there is really on point. The store selection also gives us, this might not be ROI focused, but it also gives us information on which store is popular. And we can kind of splice that from a data science perspective on, hey, are people shopping at Aldi's because it's closer? Like, is it based on the zip code? Now we know, so we know your zip code, Sam, and we know which store you like to shop to. We can use that to personalize experiences later on. And we can say like, hey, in your zip code, most people like to shop at Kroger. That's really interesting for us. And, as you come in and you shop again and again and again. Let's say you click Aldi's 3 or 4 times. We're not going to ask you that question after a point. We're going to be like, hey, you shopped at Aldi's 3 times. We're going to assume that you want to shop at Aldi's again. Definitely helps again with that ROI, because we're just, we're making it shorter, we're making it more concise, and we're making it easier to shop. And I think, when I think about like easy shopping experiences, I think about, Amazon's one click, like add to cart, one click buy. They actually patented that for a very, very long time, because it was so easy to check out on Amazon. And the number of people that placed an order just hit the roof. It was such an impactful experience. And so making the experience as easy as possible to try to like get through definitely has a huge ROI benefit. So really great to collect that store selection data upfront.
And then also with like reaching this point with more of like actually looking through the catalog or looking at options, that's a whole nother level of intent for a buying journey too. Of like looking at product, right? Which you'd look at anywhere else in a buying journey. Now we can look at it in conversational AI.
Yeah. So yes, get it. Yeah. So even the let's do it. Sorry, I'm going like completely in order because I love every step that you've taken here. Let's do it. Also super high intent verbiage. They're ready to start shopping. That shows us that, they're willing, they're bought in, they're high intent. With the ad, like the cart selection that you show, there's a couple different things. I think being able to add to cart is a direct business metric. And so when you're looking at it, I'm looking at it as like almost like a triangle of like what are like a funnel on what you need to do, right, to place an order from a business perspective. You have to start an order, you have to place it in cart, you have to check out, you have to, like get the order delivered. That's like, the high level. So add to cart is like a huge step in that process. And so huge ROI. Another thing that I want to add here is one of the things you did is you added Oreos with milk. So maybe I just needed, like my low fat milk, but now you've added Oreos. And so now I really, really want Oreos, obviously. And I think that's a really interesting like psychology thing, right? Is like, I don't want to necessarily call it like upselling, because I think that's like a little bit more of a dark pattern, but really trying to kind of predict what the user wants. And, as you order again and again and again, you can use this, this carousel to be like, oh, last time like Sam ordered, like with his eggs, he ordered like pancakes. So we're gonna, add that in there. And so that's like another, like area where you can start adding stuff that would directly tie into your ROI.
I love that. And I think that's the beauty too here, where you can actually add dynamic like API images, get and push requests for images, user data, and say like, okay, great, like there's a trend here. And at a certain point, based on like the dev component that they built, okay, we're going to add Oreos, or like you always shop at Aldi, right? Like those type of like reoccurring personalization things are just a little touch that goes a long way. One of my favorite things to do too is just like even adding in, based on the username, and just saying like, great, like now we know the username, we know the user preferences. Let's add that into the text and make it even more personalized, right? So here we're starting to see that in each of these blue points, just as in like a traditional buying experience, whether that's in store or on a website or in a mobile app, now in this conversational AI interface, we're actually mapping conversation design best practices to business results and actually how people buy, which is honestly, people oftentimes are just staying in the bubble of I'm designing a conversation in the way that I want to. But now we're actually starting to see, yes, great conversation design meets effective conversational AI ROI mapped to business results.
Yeah, absolutely.
I did want to, before we take questions, I also wanted to show this one more time, because I think this kind of just drives home that last point we were talking about here. Is here we go back to that user journey, right? So on the business side, we want to create high intent audiences. We want to know they browse the catalog, added cart, completed purchase. Now all of a sudden on the assistant side, we have exact definitions that map one-to-one, right? Is a new user with 0 sessions. They've reached the carousel, they've added an item from the carousel, and they finished the checkout flow. All of a sudden you're able to map and equally create personas within Voiceflow and run prototypes to these different audiences, quickly A/B testing and saying, hey, can you try this? Which one does better, right? And I think now all of a sudden you have a standard language of ROI to map and test against for the first time, right? A lot of times there isn't that bridge between the two.
Yeah, that's super well said. I agree with that.
Wonderful. Great. Well, I think we're about 10 minutes out from the end here, so I did want to open it up to questions for anyone if there are any remaining questions from the audience. I think I always like to kind of summarize my big takeaway. And I think the thing I've learned in just chatting with you is just that I do think that there needs to be more of a bridge between conversation design best practices and how the business works, right? And I think it doesn't always need to be dollars. It can be customer experience. It can be, those qualitative tests as well. But there definitely needs to be a translation layer and a bridge for conversational AI to continue to have that bigger seat at the overall customer table. Any other questions? Donna, you were talking about personalization. Yeah, absolutely. And like the backend data set is so important there, where it's not just what you put in Voiceflow, right? Voiceflow is that layer that is able to, internalize and process the variables in the API calls. But the more user data that you have that's been provided, why not use it? Why not deploy it to make it even more personalized? Because it's already been shared with you. So why not go the extra mile to use it effectively?
Yeah, and I think when you do that as well, you excite, the data science team, because oftentimes, taking data science models and actually putting them into production is really, really hard. And conversational experiences are a good way to do that. And so, leveraging that data, leveraging, all of the different teams that we talked about, and talking about ROI from different perspectives also gets people really, really excited and kind of builds up, the momentum for their conversational experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I did want to show just before we wrap here that I was just thinking about as well, you had talked about like spinning up quick A/B tests, right? And I think it's so important, like to not rely on like, okay, great, like let's take something to production and then wait. I think one thing that we've seen people do now is like creating versions of projects or even using domains to create like different types of assistants. And then actually like, let's say we even just duplicate this place order flow within the flow, right? And you say, okay, great. Like we know we want to test against this, changing content here and just sending out the experience to two different audience groups and seeing which performs better, right? And then going forward with your designs, you're iterating on real customer data, but in smaller subsets. So by the time you actually go to dev or you go to a different stakeholder group that we talked about, you've already done initial user testing and proving of ROI. So you don't have to wait for something to get to production anymore, which I think is so powerful and enables a lot of the work a lot of the tips you had shared as well. We did just have one more question here. Quick question. How do you initiate a paradigm shift for CAI teams that are very developer-led and haven't really been bought into the value of having a CXD team? Have you encountered that with your team?
Yeah, I actually, when I first started my career, I joined a purely development team. I was reporting to an engineering manager who didn't quite understand what conversation design is, didn't understand what UX design was. They really thought of it as like graphic design. And one of the first ways that I proved out the value was honestly just auditing what we currently had. So we had a a funnel to collect leads, where we essentially just ask people like, what's your name? What's your email? This is for the home mortgage, space, like what's your credit score? And I think that funnel performed at about like a 30% completion rate. So that means that about 30% of people who started off talking to us that told us that they were interested in buying a home would actually give us enough data so we could submit a lead for them and then call them back or email them back. We had engineers writing content. We had engineers designing the experience. And obviously engineers are great at engineering, but they're not, experienced designers. They're not content writers. And so I could very quickly add value. And I was able to say like, hey, in a week, we pushed it up to, like a 40%, increase. And then in like a month, we pushed it up to 60%. I think at the highest that was performing was like an 80% success rate, which is absolutely fantastic for like the lead gen funnel flow. And that was super easy. And then once you put that in front of, high level, like directors, stakeholders, even like managers, and you say like, hey, this is bringing in, 3 times the revenue it was before. It's not really like an argument at that point, right? It's a hard number.
Yeah, non-negotiable because you blended really good build and production with design, creative content, and flow design overall, right? Yeah, spot on. Elaine has 2 questions. I'll start with the fun one. She said, what kind of coffee are you drinking? What's in your cup?
Oh my God, I said this in the beginning too. I'm drinking a fake pumpkin spice latte. I ordered a pumpkin spice latte. They definitely didn't put pumpkin spice in it. I'm very caffeine driven right now and my voice keeps cracking because I definitely have sipped water for coffee. But it's all good.
We almost made it through. 6 more minutes, one more coffee. And then more specifically, which I think is a great question from Elaine, when do you decide a certain metric needs to be changed, or over time a new focus is needed?
That is a fantastic question. Oftentimes, and I've seen this with conversational experiences, is you try to optimize a metric that no longer needs to be looked at because it's just super optimized. I've seen this specifically with like NPS or like CSAT, if you're familiar. It's like customer satisfaction or net promoter score. You get to a level, and after a certain point, there's just no need to continue optimizing it. Like that's as happy as people are going to get, and there isn't really an ROI benefit to keep going. And kind of like, again, when you define success, define what's that like upper limit. And knowing when you're getting close to that upper limit so you can start thinking about other things, because you don't want to reach a place where you've optimized everything that you've already thought about and your stakeholders are going, well, we've done everything we can, because like the reality of the situation is conversational experiences are so new. We're like nowhere near like exploring how much we can do with them. So it's almost like knowing like, okay, once we hit 60% on this metric, we're going to start thinking about these backlog of ideas and these different use cases that we could potentially look at.
Yeah, it goes back to not spending hundreds and hundreds of hours to reach all the 100% ROI improvement, but instead 60% ROI improvement is far and away better than not even addressing it, right? Or spending so much time and wasted time, right? To get the marginal return. Spot on.
Yeah, there's like that UX quote, I think, where it's like, they always say like 80% of your problems are like through 20% of your features. And I think that's true. And like 80% of your ROI is going to come from that 20%. And there's no point going after like the rest, it's just not worth it after a point.
So go quick, test quick, fail quick, discover quickly, and then double down on that 20% through iterative testing. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, precisely.
Great. Well, I think I exhausted everyone's questions in the chat. I had some great ones, so appreciate that. If you have any other ones for Ayesha, feel free to email me after and I'll pass them on to her. But as we wrap, most of all, thank you so much for your time. I mean, that was like so specific and so like tactic driven. So thank you for like actually sharing your insight, and hopefully people can take the frameworks and run with them, because I think they're applicable tomorrow for teams and for leaders.
Yeah, thank you so much for facilitating this discussion. I had a really great time.
Wonderful. Well, enjoy the rest of your coffee, your fake pumpkin spice
fake
latte.
Pumpkin spice.
Go get another one maybe if you're feeling crazy, and we'll be back in a couple weeks for our next workshop. But thank you everyone for being here, asking great questions, and as always, enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Thanks everyone.